Hello and welcome to this special interview with UN Special Envoy for Syria Geir Pedersen. Thank you for this interview. In your latest statement to the UN on the anniversary of the Syrian war, you were very pessimistic. Where does the political process in Syria stand today, considering the 14 years of civil war?
The political process is in a deep crisis. But not only the political process. You're saying that all indicators in Syria are pointing in the wrong direction. When it comes to security, when it comes to the economy and the humanitarian situation, and indeed the political situation. And of course, if we can't solve the political crisis, we will not be able to address the other crises too. So this is a very serious challenge for all of us.
How the political process will be solved?
We have maybe not a detailed roadmap, but we have an agreement on how to solve the crisis, and that is Security Council Resolution 2254. That resolution was adopted in December 2015. And it's important to remember it was unanimous. And since then, both the government of Syria and the opposition have said that this should serve as a framework for a solution to the crisis. There has, as you know, been different attempts at meeting together. None of it has led to anything. Then in 2019, we agreed that we would sit down and negotiate a new social contract for Syria in the work of the so-called Constitutional Committee. No one, of course, believed that the Constitutional Committee in itself would solve the Syrian crisis, but that it could be a door opener into the important issues that we were discussing. But here, again, that work has been stalled for the last 2 years because of issues not related to Syria, but because the Russians do not want the Syrians to meet in Geneva because they are unhappy with the Swiss position on the war in Ukraine.
I'll get back to this. Let's discuss first the 2254 resolution. Does it still apply to the Syria situation? I mean, 2015 seems decades ago.
Yes.
Not only years ago. The situation has moved a lot locally and regionally.
I agree. Absolutely correct.
Do we need a new resolution?
No, I don't. We need to implement that resolution because it addresses the key concerns of the Syrian parties and the Syrian people, and also the concerns of the neighbors and the international community. And we are today not in a situation where it would be possible to agree on a new platform for how to deal with the Syrian crisis. And why am I saying that it is addressing all the different aspects? Well, it's addressing the question of how to find a political solution. It needs to be a compromise between Damascus and the opposition. And then it doesn't go into detail on how that compromise should look like. But it is telling us how to move forward. Then it's addressing Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. In other words, we need to find a solution to the presence of international forces in Syria. And as you know very well, today we have 6 foreign armies operating in Syrian territory. So we need to find a negotiated way out of that as well. And then it's a question about the detainees missing and the abductees that needs to be sorted out. We believe there are more than 100,000 people still missing. It's a tragedy that is basically impacting all Syrians. And then, of course, we have the economic and humanitarian crisis, which is also a key element of Security Council Resolution 2254. And last but not least, I should not go through all the different elements, but this needs to be highlighted, the question of internally displaced and refugees. Remember, there are still 12 million Syrians displaced. So this we also need to solve.
I'll get back to the refugees. This sounds like a mission impossible, what you're talking about.
Well, seriously speaking, so far it has been a mission impossible, but we can't give up. And why can't we give up? Because if we don't solve this crisis, we risk that there is no relative calm in Syria, emphasizing relative. But we have no guarantees that this will continue. And we should learn from what has happened in Gaza. You know, people believed that the Palestinian issue was dead, buried, that you didn't really need to tackle it. There is a tendency of the same thinking when it comes to Syria. It's a big mistake. If we don't start to address the serious issues of the Syrian crisis, it may blow up in our faces once more.
One more question on the internal process, on the points you mentioned. The Constitutional Committee.
Yes.
Is the UN involved? What's been achieved so far? And the confidence building. What's been? Are you also mediating between the regime and the opposition? Can we just pinpoint these quickly?
Important question. So what happened was that the UN facilitated a discussion on the Constitutional Committee, how to establish a Constitutional Committee. And we then agreed with the government in Damascus and with the Syrian opposition, the SNC, that we would have a committee of 150 people, 50 from the government side, 50 from the opposition side, and 50 from the civil society. And then we agreed on what we called a drafting committee. 15 members from the government side, 15 from the opposition, and 15 from civil society. They have met 8 times, where they have been discussing constitutional principles. And they have produced important papers. But tragically enough, that work has stopped. So what I'm trying to do is to get the parties to agree on a venue that should be acceptable to everyone. And I'm telling them, as long as you can't agree on a new venue, because we had agreed originally to meet in Geneva. Until we find an agreement on a new venue, we should continue to meet in Geneva. But the government has not accepted my invitation to do that.
Who do you think is putting hurdles?
Well, on this, it's pretty clear where the obstacle is. The obstacle is that the government do not want to come to Geneva because of Russian objection to Geneva.
Turkey.
Yes.
The US.
Yes.
Russia. Who else? So many. You mentioned 6.
Yes.
And Hezbollah, Iran. All of these countries have boots on the ground in Syria. First of all, let's talk about the local and the internal situation. Bashar al-Assad behaves as if he's won the war. Did he take over all Syria or not yet?
Well,
the Syrian army.
I think what is important to remember is that since March 2020, the front lines in Syria have not changed. So there is a relative stability. Of course, there are too many people, too many civilians still being killed, but this has created some kind of a calm. And that March 2020, what happened? It was an agreement between Russia and Turkey for a ceasefire in Idlib. At the same time, there was an understanding between the United States and Turkey that had then on the situation in the northeast. But the point is, Syria is today deeply divided, both when it comes to the society and when it comes to the geography. You have 4 distinct different areas. You have an area controlled by the government. Let's say, let's be generous and say approximately 70% of the territory. Then we have Idlib, controlled by HDS. Then we have the area controlled by the so-called Syrian interim government. And then we have the area east of the river controlled by the SDF and the Americans. So these 4 different areas are pulling in different directions. And it's a threat to the unity of Syria. So this needs to be fixed. And the point, and this is a very important point, the point is there is no military solution to this. There needs to be a negotiated way out of it. And today there is no one. Assad cannot dictate the outcome of the war in Syria, or the conflict, I should rather say, in Syria. The Russians cannot, the Iranians cannot, the Turks cannot, and the Americans cannot.
Who can?
No one. This is part of the challenge, is that you need to find a solution in Syria. You not only need the Syrian parties, but you need also the international parties.
So this is officially a proxy war, because unless we can say, unless the West reconciles somehow with Russia, and somehow we're going to tie the conflict in Syria to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I mean,
I think that's the realm of speculations. I would phrase it differently. Oh. I would say that it's important that, first and foremost, that the Syrian parties come to an understanding. The Syrian parties still have agency. And if the Syrian parties were willing to move forward, that would have a deep impact also on the regional and the international players. So that would be a very positive move. But some of the issues are not in the hands of the Syrians alone. Huh? There you need some kind of understanding. But let's use the term understanding between the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, and the Americans. And without that understanding being supported by the Arabs and the Europeans, it would be very difficult to implement it.
With the Gaza war happening and the recent escalation between Iran and Israel, the Syrian regime seems to be calm, not engaging in any attacks towards Israel or even supporting Hamas. Have you passed any messages to the Syrian regime not to engage?
Listen, it's correct, as you said, that Syria is not directly involved in the war. But of course, as you will have noticed, there has been Israeli attacks on Syria for quite a while, and that has intensified since the beginning of the war in Gaza. And then you have had groups in Syria, not the government per se, but groups in Syria that also have attacked targets in Israel. So there's a lot to be said about that. But what is important is that we need to prevent the spread of the war in Gaza to Syria, even more than what it has today. And this is a responsibility, of course, of Israel. It's a responsibility of the Syrian government. It's a responsibility of those that are active in Syrian territory, like the Iranians. And if we then get a ceasefire in Gaza, it's very important that we also de-escalate in Syria. Not only on the issues related to the war in Gaza, but also that we continue to de-escalate the situation in the northwest and the situation in the northeast. And what I've been appealing for since the very beginning of our mandate, in line with Security Council Resolution 2254, is that we also need a nationwide ceasefire in Syria itself. And I think that should be the next challenge also for the international community.
Mm-hmm. Let's discuss the refugees. 5 million refugees are living in neighboring countries. The economic situation is dire.
Yes.
In Lebanon, in Jordan. Turkey is also not that great when it comes to the refugees' problems. What is the UN doing, especially like countries like Lebanon want to push back those refugees back into Syria?
I think it's very important that we remember that also inside of Syria, the situation is extremely grim. Very important to remember. There are now 16.9 million people inside of Syria in need of humanitarian assistance. 9 out of 10 are living in poverty. So let's remind ourselves also of that fact. Then, as you rightly pointed out, the situation for the refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan and in Turkey, extremely challenging. There are differences, of course, between the situation for the refugees in these three countries. But I do believe that we need to speed up the political process to find a solution to this. And how can we do that? There are two issues that needs to be addressed. It's the issue about what we call livelihood, to make sure that the economic and humanitarian situation improves inside Syria. And the second situation that needs to improve in Syria is what we call protection issues. These are the two major concerns of refugees living in Lebanon, living in Jordan, and living in Turkey. And if we were able to address these issues, I think we would start to see more refugees returning to Syria.
Mr. Pedersen, but the argument that Lebanese, for example, or some members in the Lebanese government say, many of these refugees are just in Lebanon to work and because they want to live there. Some of them go to Syria and then come back to Lebanon?
Well, I think you know just as well as I that this is nothing new. There's always been, a few 100,000 Syrians that have been coming to Lebanon for work.
Yeah, but there's a difference between a few 100,000 and few millions.
Well, let's not overdo the numbers, because that's not the issue. The issue is, as I said, that for refugees to return, it needs to be a safe environment and it needs to be livelihoods. And the ones who are basically judging whether that is the case, I'm afraid, is the refugees themselves.
But is Lebanon more safe than Syria?
Well, obviously the refugees are feeling that. So this is not my statement. It's not your statement. This is what they are telling the UNHCR. The UNHCR, as you know, are asking the Syrian refugees every year, what would it take for you to go back to Syria? And as I said, there are basically there are other things too, but there are two major challenges: the livelihood in Syria, the economic and humanitarian crisis, and the feeling that there is a lack of protection.
So if governments like Lebanon and Turkey force or push Syrians back into Syria, and there's a tendency to do that, what's your position as UN?
Our position is very clear. There needs to be voluntary return, and we should prepare the ground for that. And that, I think, is linked also to the political crisis. Listen, there is no easy way out when it comes to Syria. There are no shortcuts. So anyone who believes that there are shortcuts to solving the problems in Syria are plainly wrong. And this comes also when it is related to the question of refugees, I'm afraid.
One last question. What's your message to the donors? There's a Syria fatigue, and Syria has become a forgotten story.
Absolutely right. Thanks for that, because this is extremely important. So when the needs are increasing, both inside of Syria and within the refugees communities, the support has been going down. This, of course, is not acceptable. We need to see a new donor commitment to the Syrian people, whether they are living inside or living as refugees in the neighboring countries. And it is my hope that we will be able to mobilize the traditional donors and new donors to these efforts, because it's extremely urgent. You're absolutely right.
Final question. How can you stay interested and enthusiastic about such a complex place and situation with so many powerful countries involved as you personally?
It's my duty. It's my duty to the Syrian people to try to make a difference. I know we haven't been successful, but the UN will never give up.
Aren't you frustrated sometimes?
I'm very frustrated, very often very frustrated. But it doesn't mean that we can stop the work that we are doing.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.